Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today, inshallah, is our fourth lesson in the Fiqh of Da'wah course. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than obviously the first two sessions, actually the first three sessions, which is we're going to focus a lot on ulum ad-din, the sciences of Islam. And the reason why I want to give a brief muqaddimah or an introduction to all the Islamic sciences is because I feel as du'at, as da'wah carriers, we need to be well-rounded in the Islamic sciences. You will come across situations where a Christian might ask you, if you don't think that the Bible is authentic, why should we believe that the Quran is authentic? Why should we believe the ahadith, the prophetic traditions of the Prophet ﷺ? What is your criterion for knowing what's right and what's wrong, and what's reliable and what's unreliable? And so in Islam, alhamdulillah, we have a complete system of how to verify transmission, right? So we have what we call hadith, which are mutawatir, which are widespread. This is when you have at least 5 companions that heard Amr ibn Hissi, they heard directly from the Prophet ﷺ, words coming out of his mouth or actions that they physically saw him doing, or they saw him tacitly approving certain actions. And when something becomes mutawatir, that means it is now beyond doubt, when it's 5+ narrators. And the entire Quran has reached the status of mutawatir, and it's way more than just 5 companions, but we have this, with rest assured, for the entire Quran. We also have this for ahadith. Now, normally, ahadith doesn't reach the level of mutawatir very often. Out of the 11,000 ahadith that are maqbool, that are acceptable, about 6,000 of them are, should I remember correctly here, 6,000 sahih, and about 4,400 or 4,000 are hasan, which are basically good or acceptable. And the main difference here is that when we have sahih and hasan narrations, we have basically credible ahadith, but they don't have as many chains of transmission. So a sahih hadith, when we say sahih, we basically mean something that is either between 1 and 4 chains typically. So if it's 1 chain of transmission, we call the hadith gharib, but we can call it gharib sahih. So it's strange that we only find 1 chain, but it's authentic in the sense that everybody in the isnad, in the chain of transmission, is dhabat. They have sound memory, so they're all relating the ahadith the exact same way as the next person within the chain of transmission. Every person in the chain of transmission is at their adala. They are righteous people, they are just people, and they're thiqa, basically, that they're reliable. And the hadith is muttasil, meaning that there's all connected points between each rawi, each narrator. So there was liqa, there was an actual meeting that took place. And through the science of jarh wa ta'dil, we actually have muhaddithin, scholars, who verify that at each period of time that this person indeed met the next person in the chain of transmission. So this all goes into proving that a hadith is sahih, and that there's no illat khafiyya, there's no hidden defects. There's not, like, for example, somebody misnamed one of the narrators for somebody else. And there's sometimes these minor errors, or these hidden errors, sometimes they're deliberate and sometimes they're non-deliberate. But the muhaddithin are very close to scrutinizing the ahadith so that we don't have this problem, inshallah ta'ala, in Islam. And then obviously you can have a hadith which is sahih, which is aziz, has 2 chains of transmission. So the same hadith from 2 chains of different narrators, and then you can have a hadith which is mashhur, which is 3+. And so this is from the sahih category. The only difference between sahih and hasan is that in a hasan hadith, everybody is dhabat. This is the only one thing that's different. Everybody is adala, everybody is basically upright, righteous. The hadith is muttasil, everybody's connected in the chain, but the only main weakness here is that somebody, their wording is a little bit off. It's kind of like on an average day when we try to remember everything that we learn at school, right? We try to paraphrase what the teacher said to us in class. We understand the gist of the concepts and what was conveyed, but could we always quote them word for word? And the answer is no, but the meaning is still intact. So if this is the case, then we have a hadith hasan. Just as a default, that's generally what hasan ahadith look like. Then we have hadith that are da'if, and hadith that are da'if, the main criterion, there are many reasons why a hadith could become da'if, but the number one reason is that the hadith is not muttasil. There's at least one person in the chain of narration who is majhul, who is unknown, or there's just simply a missing person in the chain of transmission. We can't say that the hadith is fabricated, we're not going to say that the hadith is mawdu', but there's a big question mark on these types of ahadith. They're almost 50-50. So that's why da'if hadith, classically and even in modern day times, it's always been an issue of debate amongst the scholars as to can we use weak ahadith. And the majority of scholars opine that you can use it at least when it comes to manners and virtues. Because as long as we're not talking about hukm shar'i, Islamic rulings, there are many ahadith that encourage us to do good deeds that are already mentioned in sahih ahadith or already mentioned in the Quran. And in this case, there's very little problem with narrating such ahadith. But if we're going to say, we're going to do basically establish rulings or give fatwa based on weak hadith, then the majority of scholars would have a problem with this. And even the scholars who will use weak hadith, they will be careful around hadith, which they would call da'if jiddan, which is very weak hadith. So they have different classifications of weak hadith. Why am I even telling you all of this stuff? Why is this important for a da'i to know? Is because you will come across situations where either an enemy of Islam or a skeptic of Islam will come to you and they will give you some weak narrations that most scholars don't even use. So you need to have the tools to know, how can I check these ahadith? So you should know, for example, we're going to look at some resources today. So for example, looking at sunnah.com, so you can get a quick takhrij or a hukm of the hadith. If it was sahih, if it was hasan, or it's da'if, these things will be mentioned on sunnah.com. Or you can check Islam Q&A, islamweb.com. These websites are fatwa websites that give you not only the explanation of the hadith, but obviously the authenticity, and if there's a dispute on the authenticity of a hadith. Another thing you want to consider is that when you hear a hadith, if it's not from the Prophet ﷺ, it's from, let's say it's from a companion, like the greatest mufassir of the Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Abbas. He's considered to be the greatest of the scholars of his time in terms of tafsir. So he's the greatest mufassir. However, he has opinions that are really just known to be his own. And so I remember there's a brother he's basically the cousin of my wife, and unfortunately he's an atheist, even though he's Arab. And he brought up an opinion from Abdullah ibn Abbas, which is somewhat controversial, about something about like the earth being on the back of a turtle or on the belly of a turtle or something like this. It's a bit of not a mainstream view that many people hear about, but it's in its opinion. The thing is that most scholars will tell you is that an opinion of a sahabi, or not just a sahabi, an opinion of any scholar, if it's not an ayah or a hadith, it's technically not an evidence. A ra'i on its own is an opinion. If somebody said, Sheikh Al-Albani said this, and Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen said this, and Imam Malik said this, and Imam Shafi'i said this, well, those are their opinions, but you can't say that just an opinion or a conclusion of a scholar is now a brand new evidence. It doesn't mean it can't be followed. You can follow a fatwa, but a fatwa is not an evidence in and of itself. The evidence has to go back to the original masdar. What's the original source? Quran and authentic sunnah. So it's always important to note that, because if somebody comes to you, oh, the Sheikh so-and-so said this. Well, alhamdulillah, it's great that he said that, but if it's not directly from the Prophet ﷺ, then it's not wahi. And if it's not wahi, we're not going to use this as evidence. So don't get cornered in a debate or a discussion about something that's not really necessarily evidence to begin with. So that's why it's important to note that. I know I'm kind of jumping on a wild tangent, but I'm giving you a clear-cut example of just one of the Islamic sciences that you would think, why would a da'i need to know so much about ilm al-hadith? And I'm not saying to actually know that much about this science, like just to take an introductory course to the science of hadith. So for example, to study the book Nuqbat al-Fiqh, which is a famous book of Usul al-Hadith written by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Inshallah ta'ala, I think Sheikh Adnan and maybe some of the other faculty at IDA would be able to supply at least one introductory course so that you have a foundation of how the science works, so that you can understand it, and if there's any confusion when you're debating with people, you can explain to them the criterion on how we actually evaluate both the Quran and the Sunnah, inshallah ta'ala. So we also have 4 slides on ad-din al-nasiha, so we'll just quickly wrap that up before going into the Islamic sciences. And then I want to make a lot of recommendations in this particular lecture from famous du'at that exist today and some famous Islamic books geared towards da'wah specifically. Because within the 12 weeks or so of this course that we have, I can't teach you everything. I can definitely teach you enough that in 95% of the scenarios in street da'wah, you will be able to hold your own. And you'll have enough resources to quickly get the extra commentary that you need. But we want to give you a roadmap for greater development. So inshallah, some of the recommendations I'm going to give you and some of the personalities, some of the modern day du'ats that I'm going to show you, if you were to spend some time and watch maybe 10, 50, or 100 hours, up to you, of their content, you would very quickly become somebody who's almost a professional in the field. We have a lot of expert du'at in the ummah right now, so I'm going to mention some of their names bi'idhnillah in this dars, inshallah. So before we talk about that, I said we're going to quickly wrap up ad-din al-nasiha, because we said last week that da'wah is not just to ghayr al-muslimin, to the non-Muslims. There's two types of da'wah. There's da'wah to accept the truth of Islam, and then there's basically a maintenance type of da'wah to make sure that Muslims are obeying Allah and understanding the deen of Allah at the optimum level. Because obviously not all Muslims are at the same level. You have the very base of Muslims, which we call the awam, the common people, and they usually, if in most cases, they don't actually know the direct evidences for most of the things that they do. Why, for example, you pray with your hands above the navel or below the navel, if the hadith is hasan or if it's da'if. So a person who's maybe one level above this, who's basically a talib al-ilm, they would know, okay, we have two ahadith on this topic. They're both da'if, so they both have some weakness to them. But because these are the only ahadith that are available on the position of where to have your hands in terms of above and below, then we know now that this is one of the issues of flexibility. Because both hadith have some issues, but it's basically all that we have on this topic. I'm not talking about qabd. Qabd, there are 17 ahadith that mention right hand over the left. So that's very, super authentic. But as far as how high above the belly button, above the navel, or how low, then the hadith on these are very few. And basically it's an issue of controversy, and there's a bit of weakness on both positions, but this should tell you something very important in the da'wah scene, and this is more towards when we're dealing with each other, is that when you know that there's a valid evidence for both sides, this should never be a reason why when we come to the masjid, if you see somebody praying like a Hanafi and his legs are a little bit more inwards and his hands are clasped below the belly button, and then right beside him you have like a Shafi'i or most likely it would be the Shafi'i and the Malikiyya. They would have their hands like this, and then you'd have also the Hanbalis. Classically, they would have their hands below like the Hanafis. So you really have like 50-50 in this case, if you're going with the Mu'tamid or the Mashhur of each of the Madahib. So this is one of those issues that if for over 1,000 years, it was a 50-50 split of these two different positions, no reason why any of us should be looking down at each other or condemning somebody for something which is based on valid evidences, as long as they are sourced back to the Quran and Sunnah. Question? Right. Right. So the thing is the yad is technically the hand, but it can actually include the entire arm as well. And it might have something also to do with the fact of practicality. I know sometimes in the salah, I have some brothers that they almost trick me. They come beside me and I think, okay, we're all squared up, we're good. And all of a sudden they inflate to about 50% of the size they were right when the takbir happens. And then I don't know what to do other than to go like this or to go like this. So I don't really have a choice at this point. So when that happens, I'm just kind of like, you know what, I'll take that third opinion in the Shafi'i school that says anywhere here is still considered clasping the right hand over the left, since the yad can mean hand or the entire arm, and I'll take that opinion so that I can actually fit in the saf, in the row that I happen to be in. Question? There is, but it's a bit indirect. So there are some ahadith that talk about raising the hands and them dropping, but they don't really specify if they stayed where they fell, for example. So the Malikiyya, some will make the argument that there are some ahadith that mention of the Sahaba doing rafa' yadayn for the takbiratul ihram, and then the hands falling down, but it doesn't really specify where they fell down to. And it's specific to the Maliki madhab and obviously the Shia and the Ja'fari madhab from the Shia about putting the hands at the side. It's a bit of controversy whether Imam Malik was actually beaten or not. Some people say that actually that never happened. But some people say that the reason why Imam Malik prayed like that is because he was beaten. Again, if you ask the Malikiyya that, they'll say, no, we don't buy this story. Question. So what happened was the wali, the governor at the time of Imam Malik, wanted to issue a verdict that he could force people to divorce their wives by coercion. And Imam Malik made a public statement in front of the community and said, I am Malik ibn Anas, and I reject this opinion that you could force somebody to divorce. And as a result of that, he was, according to the narration, he was beaten as a result of that. Right, right, sure, okay, sure. Sure. Well, the interesting thing about qabd in general is regardless if you put your hands here or here, all four madahib say that this act of putting the hand over the right over the left is only sunnah according to all four madahib. So none of them say this is nawaqid as-salah. None of them say this invalidates your prayer if you didn't do this. If you do this the whole time, regardless of what madhab you follow from the at least the four established ones, none of them would say your prayer is at risk at all. Kind of like the tashahud. It's sunnah to point the finger. It's a debate whether we point it straight, we hold it up like the Malikiya do, whether we wiggle it, whether we don't wiggle it, whether we keep it up at certain times or we don't. I know now I'm going on to too many tangents, but that's also one of those things that does not invalidate your salah if you don't do it. And so what would be the additional benefit of discussing these side points is what the scholar says, when you know there's valid evidences, they have a qaida or a rule. They call it la inkar fi masail al-khilaf. There is no inkar, there's no condemnation, there's no, hey, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Invalid differences of opinion. So we need to know that as Muslims when we're dealing with each other, and then obviously when we're dealing with non-Muslims, it helps to know about fiqh al-muqarana, comparative fiqh, because sometimes, depending on who a non-Muslim asks, he might go to a Hanafi follower, or he might go to a Maliki or a Shafi or Hanbali. He's going to hear different things. And you say, how could Islam have so many different opinions? And what would be the response to that? Most of the scholars say this is actually a rahmah from Allah. They don't look at this as a bad thing. They look at it as there's many benefits to the fact that Allah did not make every ayah and hadith qat'i ma'nawi, like clear in having only one meaning. There are ayat that are clear in meaning. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad. There's no ikhtilaf on what this means, that Allah is one, He's the self-sufficient. But there are ahadith and ayat that have to do with Islamic rulings that are dhanni. Dhanni means speculative or ambiguous. It could have more than one possible meaning. The scholars, they say that this is a mercy so that it could basically allow Islam to express itself in many ways, and this could serve many times. Another benefit is it actually forces us to have mujtahideen, scholars who do ijtihad. Ijtihad comes from the word jahada, to struggle, so that you actually have to struggle to find out what did Allah actually want us to do, or what is qawl al-raja, what is the more authentic opinion. It forces us to be people of aql, of intellect. And because our deen isn't basically so cut and dry that we actually have to kind of sift through and make sense out of some of these ayat and hadith that have multiple layers to them, this forces us to be very deeply connected to our religion. So there's actually many benefits. And another thing is there's a hadith that I'm just going to kind of mention bil ma'na, not word for word, but it's like Allah has not spoken about certain things out of mercy for us, not out of forgetfulness. So it's not that Allah forgot to tell us things. He actually did this as a mercy to us. When we don't know certain things in our deen with absolute certainty, we actually have an excuse for ourselves on the day of judgment. Whereas if everything was, very rigid and everything only had one possible interpretation, you have a higher percentage now of actually being blameworthy. What's a clear example of this? If we look at Yahud, not just any Yahud, the Jews that were mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, what were they told to do? They were told to slaughter a cow. It was really simple, right? Just a cow. Could have been a black cow, brown cow, big cow, small cow, any kind of cow. Could be a cow on the moon even if you could get up there. The point is, it was simple, but they made it difficult for themselves. They asked too many questions. They said, well, what kind of a cow? How big? How old? How young? What color? This, that. Next thing they knew, they made it so specific, and Musa ﷺ kept going to Mount Sinai and kept coming back with a more specific criterion, that they only found one cow that met this criterion, and it was extremely expensive to purchase this cow so they could slaughter it, and they almost didn't do it. So really what they did is they made it a lot more difficult for themselves, just to kind of show you a little bit of a comparison. So anyways, La inkar fi misa'il al-khilaf, there is no condemnation when it comes to valid differences of opinion. We can know to use this both when we discuss with Muslims, obviously for the sake of benefiting each other and empowering each other and learning more from each other and being a jama'ah, being together, but also when we deal with non-Muslims who they're going to hear a lot of different stuff, especially on the internet. And they won't know how to sift through it. And they might not see the wisdom and the beauty why there are some differences of opinion in Islam. We're not really talking for the most part about aqeedah here. We're talking about issues of fiqh, of Islamic law. There might be some nuances when it comes to aqeedah, but the issues are very few. And we'll discuss actually how we're going to deal with that soon, inshallah. But first, this hadith. So, عن علي ibn Hussein, قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن من حسن إسلام المرء تركه ما لا يعني. Which means that Ali ibn Hussein, who's obviously we know Ali ibn Abi Talib here. So Ali ibn Hussein reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Verily, among excellence of Islam is for a man to leave that which does not concern him." So in general, when we're not supposed to pry into people's personal business. That's what this is talking about. It's not about seeking knowledge. It's talking about us going into people's personal affairs or looking for juicy gossip and stuff like that and trying to put somebody in a position where their honor could be slandered or tainted. Question? Yes. Right. Right. So we'll explain why that doesn't work, because we're going to look at another hadith, which is one of the most detested things to Allah, is that if somebody basically advises you and you respond by saying, alayka nafsak, mind your own business. So actually in Islam, we're supposed to advise people, and what nasiha is, if you ask the classical scholars, you look at their works, you look at their shuruh, nasiha means when I advise a brother or sister in Islam, I do it wholeheartedly, wanting good for the other person. If my niyyah is I want to insult them, I want to make them look bad, I want to shame them in front of other people, that's not true nasiha. But we also know in Islam that we have this concept of amr bil ma'ruf wa nahyan al munkar, So commanding the good and forbidding the evil. Allah told us in the Quran, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Which means, let there be from among this nation, this ummah, people who will command the good and forbid the evil. And these are the people who are successful. So there should be no doubt in anybody's mind. This ayah is ayah 104 in Surah Ali Imran. There should be no doubt that in Islam, we have to call towards the good and we have to forbid the evil. If we don't, how are we going to thrive and survive as an ummah? If we see fahisha and munkar, immorality happening right in front of our eyes and nobody says anything. If people didn't stand up for this religion and didn't advise each other, then everybody would be dealing with riba on a daily basis. Everybody would be wearing whatever they want on a daily basis. Because what would they say? They would say, alayka nafsak, mind your own business. So that doesn't work. So the only issue here with this is digging into people's private affairs. In Islam, if you have a khilafah system, an actual Islamic state, the khilafah, or the khalifa, the ruler, and his guards and his close by helpers and representatives, they're not supposed to actually go into people's homes and pry into their business. Look up any fatwa on the issue of tajassus, on spying. They'll tell you that spying is haram in Islam. You're not supposed to go and eavesdrop on people. And that even means that the government can't walk into your house and look into your private business. And there's a great mercy in that if you're doing something in your life that's wrong, you have the opportunity to go to Allah and fix it. You don't have to ruin your reputation for the rest of your life. But if you're going to be a person who has no sense of aib, no sense of shame, and you're going to publicize your sins, now that's very dangerous. That's one of the reasons why Allah might not forgive a person on the Day of Judgment. That person is called al-mujahara, the guy who goes out and publicly commits sins. If a person is an alcoholic, they drink alcohol. If they do it in private and they make tawbah to Allah, Allah will forgive them. But if they do it in public, now they run the risk of state punishment, right? Of being, in most cases, a type of ta'zir, where the sultan or the ruler has the right to choose what the punishment is going to be. But the point is, if you have no shame, you're going to go out in public and you're going to spread evil and un-Islamic values, there's no way that can be left to happen. Otherwise, society would be corrupted and destroyed. So Islam has to have a defense mechanism to make sure that Islam stays original, that Islam stays based on its original values and its original teachings and principles and rulings. So therefore, there's no question that we need to command towards the good and forbid the evil. However, we need to be sensible. Our goal is not to shame people, to put people down. We want to, in the best way, find a way to honor them. And if we looked at the last few slides from the last lecture, we discussed the issue of, well, actually I told you guys to read the last few slides on your own because of the time. Basically what Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, what they argue for is basically private counsel. That if you really want to give nasihat to somebody, if you have to make a choice between private or public, you always choose private. Public is only if you don't have a choice. Like if I want to advise a brother, and it doesn't matter what I do, he keeps doing what he's doing and he's doing it in public, I can't advise him in private, then I might have to escalate to public advice. But if I can deal with the issue on the DL, on the down low, and basically preserve his honor and work with him and counsel him, right? Like just like how a counselor would, like a psychologist would. If I can do this in private, that's the way to do it. Worst case scenario, it has to become public, but that's if private doesn't work. Sure. Mhm. Just in general, so ikhtilat, or the mixing of the genders, is permissible when there's a reason. So like seeing a doctor, getting legal advice, getting a fatwa from a scholar. So but there has to be a reason. It can't just be like just general chit chat, hey, let's go to the movies type of thing, right? I'm sure you guys already know that. So the other thing is that then there's layers or levels of who would be best suited to solve the problem. So let's say a woman has a very complicated fiqh issue. It might not be for me to address that issue. Maybe I would say, you know what, your best bet is to go to Sheikh Adnan, or to go to Imam Jamali, or go to somebody else, like a person who deals with these types of issues on a regular basis, who's a specialist or an expert. So, but in some cases, it might be your own blood sister. And then maybe that person would only listen to you if you're their blood relative, right? So that also has to be taken into consideration, is who would be most conducive to helping this person. So you have to consider that as well. So whoever would basically be most likely able to fix the problem. That's like the best way for me to explain it, inshallah. So next slide. Oh, we're going the wrong way here. Okay. So it's mentioned in the book of At-Tirmidhi that Abu Darda radiallahu anhu reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whoever protects the honor of his brother, Allah will protect his face from the fire on the day of resurrection. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu said that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do you know what is backbiting? The companions said, Allah and his messenger know better. Thereupon he said, backbiting is talking about your Muslim brother in a manner which he dislikes. It was said to him, what if my Muslim brother is as I say? He said, if he is actually as you say, then it is backbiting, ghiba. But if it is not what is true about him, then it is slandering or namima, which is basically lying mixed with gossip, or lying mixed with backbiting. So it's even worse, because lying is already a major sin. Even to joke and lie at the same time is a major sin. So if you, no, it says, because it says what he dislikes, so not what he likes. So if you say, you know, mashallah, this guy, he's an all-star athlete, say it 1,000 times, if he's okay with that, you're safe, inshallah. And there's also 6 conditions, or exceptions actually, when backbiting is permissible in a situation where the person would not like it. One of them has to do with if a person is doing public dhulm. So if there's a ruler and they're doing public dhulm against the people, no, you don't have to stay silent. Obviously, you would try to advise the person private, but if that is not possible, then in this case, you are allowed to basically accuse the ruler, even if in public, right? Otherwise, we go back to the concept of Islam defending its own status, right? Sure. Right. So, 2 things here. First issue is, when would ghiba be permissible? I advise you guys to look at Imam Nawawi's, he has a little treatise on this, 6 reasons or 6 situations when it's permissible to backbite. One of them, for example, being like, let's say you have a relative that you want to help. They don't want to seek help from anybody, but the problem is getting out of control. So you can go and seek fatwa from a mufti or a scholar to deal with this issue because it's getting out of control. So you need to do that even though this relative of yours would not like what you have to say. That's one of the conditions, or sorry, one of the exceptions to when ghiba is permissible. Regarding the sultan or the ruler, if you want me to be frankly honest with you, the Muslim rulers that are living in the world today are technically not legitimate. And the reason why they're not legitimate, I don't mean that you should necessarily harm them or try to torture them or do anything like that, but they're not following the original system of Islam. If we look at a hadith that's in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet said, if you have 2 khulafa, kill the second of the 2. If you invite the idea to there being more than one Amir al-Mu'mineen, more than one Khalifa, you're asking for anarchy. You're asking for in-person fighting amongst the Muslimin. I don't want to make this too controversial here, but if we know what happened between Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, there was a disagreement, but because both of them were basically acting as rulers or leaders at that time, there were many Sahaba that basically ended up going to both flanks. Now, there was another twist in the mix, which was that the Khawarij actually tried to make them think that they attacked each other at night, so that incited them to fighting, but they were already in a really tense position because now you have the Sahaba arguing with the Sahaba on a political level, and things were starting to get out of control. So we can see that when you have 2 rulers of a land, things could really quickly get really messy. And Islam basically ensures that we're supposed to have unification under one ruler. We're not following that today. And unfortunately, with most of the hukam, most of the Muslim rulers of the world today, they don't actually rule fully according to Islam or even based on their own decision making. Most of it is actually based on what the West is saying they're allowed to talk about. So what America and Britain will pre-authorize, right? Like for example, what is Saudi? Is Saudi something that was like established based on the Quran and Sunnah? Saudi, I know this is going to sound like an anti-Saudi hate speech talk, but basically, if you look at like King Abdul Aziz, he was paid off by Sir Winston Churchill in Britain, and he was getting a monthly salary to go and attack the Uthmani Khilafah and kill the Muslims from within by paying other Muslims to do the job for them. And then they were told, here, we'll give you a little piece of land, and now you're a king. Does that sound like Islam? That we should get paid off by the kuffar to kill our own people and to fight against the actual Khilafah system? Obviously not. So the real system that was in place, the West has already worked to look for traitors in the ummah to ensure that that status quo doesn't return. Even though we have a hadith in Muslim Ahmad ibn Hanbal that, alhamdulillah, the Khilafah will return, but I'm just letting you know why we're in the situation that we're in. Even if they're basically like tyrannical, right? So that hadith, those hadith have a context. The hadith that says basically to obey the Amir, even if he like flogs your back, what Amir are we talking about? We're talking about the actual Amir, Amir al-Mu'mineen. So if the actual Khalifa was actually there, not somebody who's a puppet for the West, then that person, if it was a real Amir al-Mu'mineen, actually ruling according to Islam, and he was doing dhulm, then you should advise him basically and be patient. Islam didn't change its position on there being it being a fard for the Muslims to be unified under one ruler. Look at any major scholar. Look at what the writings of Imam Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah. Look at the writings of like the early 4 A'imma, like Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Look at like Imam Qurtubi said, there is an ijma amongst all the ulama of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah that it's fard to have one ruler over all the Muslims. Not 5, not 10, not 5 puppets, 10 puppets, 12 puppets. One ruler ruling according to all of Islam that all the Muslims are underneath. Just like the time of the Sahaba, just like the Khulafa Rashideen, just like the early period when the Prophet put Abu Bakr in charge, and then Umar, and then, basically there was Shura after that. But the point is that succession of Khulafa Rashida is the prophetic method, which is even mentioned in the Hadith. It calls it Minhaj Khulafa Rashideen ala Minhaj al-Nabuwa, on the path, the minhaj of the Prophet ﷺ. So that is the standard. So that is what we're supposed to have. And if that type of structure, let's say it was perfectly legitimately in place, but one of the khulafa in the past was a zalim, but he ruled according to Islam, even if he tortured people, then you still have to hear and obey. You can advise, but you don't cause anarchy if the government is legitimate. And according to the fact that he has to be a legitimate Khalifa to begin with, right? So that's the part that they don't tell you. So you have to understand that there's a reason why they might not be telling you that right now, because it's gonna result in immediate jail time and possibly death. Well, if you look at the seerah, that wasn't really the situation. If you look at Mus'ab ibn Umair when he was in Medina, was he causing bloodshed when he invited Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj to Islam? There was no bloodshed whatsoever. If you look at the seerah, it was in basically the 12th, 11th, 12th year of the seerah, almost the end of the Meccan seerah, and Mus'ab ibn Umair was sent to Medina. He went and spoke to the two tribes that had already, a few of their representatives had gone during the Hajj season, had spoken to the Prophet ﷺ, had given bay'ah to him. And then what happened after that is that there was basically an opening for the da'wah to really start spreading. There was actually three leaders in Medina that were actually very hesitant and not interested really to have their entire tribe accept Islam. But Mus'ab ibn Umair was able to eventually get the honor and the support and the acknowledgement and the acceptance of those three primary figureheads of Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj tribes in Medina. And when that happened, then basically the tribe's followers and all the members, they started accepting Islam like wildfire. And then it's not by accident that the Prophet ﷺ did hijrah to Medina. It's not just like, just let's just randomly think of going here. The Prophet ﷺ was given a vision that there would be a place with palm trees and that he would receive nusrah from there. Why did he go to Ta'if? He went to Ta'if because it matched the description of a place that would have palm trees, or specifically date palm trees. Ta'if had this and Medina had this. But we all know what happened in Ta'if, or most of us know. The people of Ta'if rejected the Prophet ﷺ. But the people of Medina, for the most part, accepted him wholeheartedly. And then obviously we know Islam just flourished from that point. But the original point that I was trying to make here is that Mus'ab ibn Umair, without any blood, without any violence, and without any anarchy really, basically convinced Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj, the two major tribes of Medina, to accept Islam. And as a result, Medina became an entire empire and the first Dawla Islamiyah, the first Islamic state. No bloodshed, just no problems in general. So there's nothing that says that that can't happen in the future, right? So we're not saying go around killing Muslims. We're talking about conveying Islam the way that it was meant to be conveyed. And then if, inshallah, one day in the future, one of the hukam actually accepts to do that, then it can be done in a very safe and, less like an unhostile way. It can be done that way. Will there be people that will try to stop it? Almost guaranteed, from other external countries in the world, for sure. But the point is, it could happen that way, right? Next slide. Sorry, guys, if I'm getting ultra political. I just have to be brutally honest here because I'm in a masjid and it doesn't really matter where I am in the world. I cannot water down or twist the religion of Islam. So this is a very important hadith about a da'i. And we're going to explain why a da'i, a caller to Islam, is actually from the people with the highest iman in faith. And why would I say that? You're going to see this based on the hadith. There's a hadith in the collection of Al-Hakim, he's a muhaddith, in his book Al-Mustadrak. Al-Mustadrak was a book written with the purpose of finding every Sahih hadith that didn't find its way into Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. And I asked Sheikh Anan about this hadith. He said some scholars consider it to be Hasan, although Hasan is still considered, as we said from the beginning, because we need to have this background knowledge of hadith. If a hadith is Sahih or Hasan, it's maqbool. It's accepted as an evidence. Mutawatir included. So mutawatir, sahih and hasan. You hear a hadith that reaches this level of authenticity, you know it's strong enough to be considered evidence. So why did I mention this hadith, or why do I want to talk about this hadith today? You'll see in a moment. It was narrated that by Imam al-Hakim in his Mustadrak on the authority of Umar radiallahu anhu, that while sitting with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, "Do you know whom the believers have the best iman?" He replied, "The angels, O Messenger of Allah." The reply came, "They are so, and they have the right to be so. For what stops them when Allah has given them such a status that He has given them? But it is other than them." So we know there's more than just the angels who've reached the pinnacle of iman, the apex, the top level. He then said, then it is the prophets, this is Umar speaking now, then it is the prophets whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored with prophethood and the message. So then the reply came from the Prophet ﷺ, they are so and they have the right to be so. For what stops them when Allah has given them such a status that He has given them? But it is other than them. So we now know that the angels and the prophets have reached the peak of Iman. But there's another group. Who's the other group? Let me get to the right point here. So the answer came. They are aqwam, groups of people that come after me in the loins of men, meaning they have not yet been born. So they believe in me, even though they have never seen me, and they find the hanging papers, so they work according to what is in it. They are the best of believers in Iman. And the scholars of tafsir and of hadith tell us the hanging papers here is referring to the Quran and Sunnah when people start to abandon it. So when you live in a time where you find people are not ruling according to Islam as a whole system, and you are a reviver for the faith, you are a person that's trying to make sure we get back to the original status quo that Allah asked of us, then if you do this, you are of the people of the best Iman. And there's no way to do this other than at least to some extent involving da'wah, involving calling people to what the actual truth is. Sure. I'm just rephrasing the question. So he's just telling me that yani, in some schools, we see Muslims going in completely different directions. Some righteous, some not righteous. And so your point is going to be okay. So they have anti Quran and anti Hadith beliefs and opinions, and that's definitely a part of da'wah. We're not saying that da'wah is only top down. Like obviously there's da'wah that involves directly going to the sultan. There's a hadith that says that the best jihad is speaking the truth to a tyrannical ruler. So it's obviously a big deal. But we also know that ad-din al-nasiha. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned a'immatul muslimina and then wa'amatihim. So to advise the rulers and the common people. So we hear directly from the Prophet ﷺ that ad-din al-nasiha, this whole religion is advice. And that includes the rulers and the common people. So it's a whole package, inshallah ta'ala. Next slide. Wow, what just happened? I only pressed the button once. I don't know how that glitch happened. Anyways, one sec. So, I already mentioned this ayah already in Arabic, but this is the English translation, right, of the ayah in Surah Ali Imran, that let there arise out of you a group of people inviting to all that is good, enjoining al-ma'ruf, and all that Islam orders you to do, and forbidding al-munkar, polytheism, disbelief, and all that Islam considers to be forbidden, and they are the successful. And what else? By you giving da'wah, this is something that I don't think gets emphasized enough. That's actually a reason for Allah averting punishment from you, adhab from you. A lot of people, and I have nothing against people making dua. Dua is considered like the essence of worship. So it's good, it's great for us to make dua and nazila and ask for the people of Palestine to be liberated and to be saved. But that doesn't mean that that is a crux or an excuse for not calling towards the haqq and not calling for the justice of Islam and not calling for the unification of the Muslim ummah, right? It doesn't mean that you substitute that and do something else. And one of the major proofs of that is the hadith that talks about how there was a qawm, a nation, and all the people of that nation had become fasiqeen, basically. They become defiantly disobedient. And Allah ordered an angel to go and to destroy this town or this village. And the angel came back to Allah Azza wa Jalla and said, but there is still one righteous worshipper among them. So inshallah, just imagine somebody praying and fasting and doing dhikr and everything you would expect from a person doing from an ibadat perspective, worshipping Allah. So what does Allah say in that hadith? Bil ma'na, He said, start the adhab, the punishment with him first. What would be the reason for that? The reason is that he saw the munkar and he turned aside. He let the munkar basically happen. He had the ilm, he had the knowledge, he could have done something about it and he did nothing, right? So this is the danger of people who deliberately try to stay out of the situation when they could have done something about it. So that's why, there's even a hadith that says that if you see a munkar, stop it with your hand. But if you cannot, it doesn't say give up, it says then with your tongue. And if you cannot, then at least hate it in your heart, but that is the least of faith. So meaning that if you could do something, if you could say something towards the truth, that would better than be staying silent. Because if everybody's silent, are we going to progress? We're not going to progress. And Allah told us in the Quran, sorry, I forgot to mention the hadith now. So the hadith about averting the punishment of Allah. So the hadith says in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, by Allah, in whose hands is my soul, you will enjoin the good and forbid the evil, or else Allah will send upon you a punishment from Him, and you will call upon Him, and He will not answer you. So it's actually incorrect for people to make dua without actually making actions in their life to make positive changes. And if we look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, who better to seek example from than Uswatul Hasana, the best of examples? Do you know that when the Prophet ﷺ, when he would go to battle, he would make dua for so long that Abu Bakr would pretty much try to stop him because he'd been standing there making dua for so long, but he did this while going into battle. So it's not like the Prophet ﷺ just stayed home and everything, just waited for everything to happen. When it came to building Masjid al-Nabawi, he participated. He actually helped pick up the bricks and tried to build. The Sahaba tried to stop him. They didn't want him to do any of the labor, but he wanted to do it. And when there was a war, a ghazawat, when there were battles, he participated in many of these battles. But at the same time, he made dua. So it wasn't like one or the other. It was a complete package. So dua is actually supposed to be a means for tawfiq, but it's not supposed to be the end. Like it's like just we make dua and let Allah take care of everything else. Doesn't that kind of sound like the people that came before us, like some of the Jews of the past? They said, let you and your, didn't they say to Prophet Musa alayhi salam, you and your Lord go fight. We're just basically going to just stay at home. Does that sound like the prophetic method? Does that sound like the minhaj an-nabuwah? I don't think so. And then in Surah Ar-Ra'd, Allah tells us we need to make these changes. If we start to make these changes from within and we're sincere, and then inshallah Allah is going to take care of the rest. But we need to do something, right? We need to start changing from within. And you're going to hear this ayah from so many people. Religious, secular, not secular, depends. But the point here is that we make the effort, Allah gives us the tawfiq, inshallah. When He wills, obviously, but the point is we're still expected to strive. Allah tells us, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Indeed, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. So we need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to, in the best way possible, give nasiha, because we said nasiha is you want actual good for the other person. You're not just trying to put them down, but you want, to help this person. You want to make them whole, and you want to help the whole of Islam. Question? Yeah, it can be understood in probably a few different ways.
People think that basically ordinary people have to change first and then kind of a change will happen.
Right.
But that never happened in the human history. Like we know that in Jahiliyyah, those people living in that Makkah, they were the worst of the people. So how will this ayah apply to them? It never happened. First, basically, a messenger is sent to the people, and one basically then that hujjah, then that is gets completed.
Sure.
If people deny that prophet or a messenger or whoever basically the right person is, then this applies. People simply take it out of context and they say everybody in the society has to change, only then will progress.
I think what sometimes people will do is they will either dilute this, or what they'll do is they'll try to segment every aspect of human life and say, if everybody is not basically living like an angel, then nothing is going to ever change. But we know, even though the Sahaba were basically the best of the people after the prophets, not everybody was a true, sincere believer. I'm not talking about the Sahaba, the good ones that we know of, but we know that there were munafiqun that were pretending to be Muslim. And we know that there were a bunch of them, and they were following, what's his name? Abdullah ibn Salul, right? If I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He is considered in the Sirah Ab al-Munafiqeen, the father of the hypocrites. And in the Battle of Uhud, he basically was one of the people who helped instruct for about 1/3 of the Muslim army, left the Battle of Uhud intentionally because they had no intention of fighting. They were just pretending to put on a show, as if we're part of the true Islam, the Muslim group. It's all basically show and play. So you have to understand that there are people in this ummah that will be insincere. But Allah still gave tawfiq to the Muslims, didn't He? Because there were many sincere people amongst them. On an individual level, we all need to change for the better. Right.
Change in the, like, for example, even right now, people will say that talk about any country, they say first we have to change, only then our situation will basically become better. But I'm saying it never happened like that in the human history. First, basically, a leader, a prophet, any righteous person comes, gives the dawah, and once people deny that, only then can something for punishment will apply to them. Otherwise, that basically it starts from top, basically, not from bottom to top. Like, it's not that everybody has to become right, and only then we will have a right ruler kind of thing, right? So it will be, it will have a right ruler, and then things will start falling into place, not the other way around.
I think I'll just say, like, like I said, like let's just look at the seerah, right? We know that there were munafiqeen, people who were pretending to be Muslim, people who literally would even come into for Salatul Fajr, and they would pray with the Muslimin. Like you wouldn't be able to tell them apart unless you knew what was inside of their heart. But for those who are sincere, as long as you had enough of them, the tawfiq can still happen from Allah Azza wa Jalla. We see directly from the seerah. What happened in Medina after the Battle of Ahzab, where there was Fath al-Mecca, and then all the neighboring tribes basically started accepting Islam. And then after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, by the time you got to the Khilafah of Umar, you basically had the entire Sassanid Persian Empire wiped out and a good portion of the Roman Empire wiped out. So Islam continued to spread despite the fact that some people were not at the top status, right? There just has to be like a certain amount of sincere, hardworking Muslims, and Allah will give tawfiq to them. But as a general rule, there has to be some taghyir, there has to be some change for any person on an individual and collective scale. If you want change, you need to strive. I hope that by making it more simplistic, that people can understand. This ayah should not be used as an excuse. And it shouldn't be said that every person has to be perfect either for change to occur. But we should be making a change. I would suggest, obviously, bottom up and top down. And if you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, many people would argue this. They would say the Prophet ﷺ spent most of the time in Mecca doing tarbiyah ground up. But he did both, actually. But the point is that he did counsel the Muslims in Dar al-Arqam. He did spend 3 years teaching them privately. But then they also went publicly in the da'wah after the 3rd year. The ayat in Surah Al-Hijr was revealed. They were told to proclaim openly. And then that's what they did. So they did both, the bottom up and the top down approach. So I think one of the biggest ills of the Muslim ummah is if people try to compartmentalize the seerah and only take certain aspects of it and not look at it holistically. If you look at it holistically, you'll see both a top-down and bottom-up approach for change towards civilization, inshallah ta'ala. Let's see, next slide. Oh, we went that way. Sorry, I'm just trying to, here we go. So now we're going to talk about the ulum ad-din. So we already kind of introduced the topic of usul hadith a bit, and I told you it's very important to understand why and how to know if a hadith is mutawatir or if it's sahih or if it's hasan, so we know what can be considered evidence for discussion. There's no point in discussing a hadith which is mawdu'a, which is fabricated, because in Islam nobody accepts a mawdu'a hadith, a fabricated hadith. So if some non-Muslim comes up to you and finds something on Wiki Islam, by the way, Wiki Islam is a well-known anti-Islam website. So if you ever go to it, don't think that just because it has wiki like Wikipedia that they're your friend here. Like there's a specific website, Wiki Islam, that is designed to try to fight against Muslims. It's like modern-day Orientalism in your face. They try to take ayat, they try to only understand it based on very weak English translations. They avoid classical tafsir, they avoid the Arabic, the nuances of the meanings of words. They try to say things like the Quran is saying that the world must be flat when there are other ayat that clearly mention that it can be round. And they try to avoid certain translations to deliberately confuse people. They do this because they want people to disbelieve in the faith. So we have to understand that in addition to that, they're also going to quote ahadith that are fabricated. And that's not going to help the situation. That's why we need to know which hadith are fabricated to begin with. That's why we need a background in the other Islamic sciences so we can see these tactics before they even arise in the scene of the da'wah. But I'm going to mention, I think, 10 different Islamic sciences that I feel like it's not about becoming a scholar here. It's just about being a good enough talib al-ilm that when you're in the da'wah, you have enough resources that any situation that's thrown at you, If you don't solve it right then and there, then within a matter of minutes, hours, or days, you will know how to deal with that situation. You will have the versatility to be able to deal with the different nuances of issues of street dawah and social media when you come across people who try to come at you with really interesting angles. We said before that if you use the go rap method, it's simple enough. It can be done in as easily as 5 minutes. You can prove to anybody that Islam is true. But are you going to find people that are going to come with their own agenda? You will. I'm not advising you, by the way, to go into all the tangent debates, but sometimes you might feel like you need to do that. You might feel like other people might get affected because sometimes you have onlookers and they're like, oh, hey, wait, can we really trust hadith? Can we really trust the Quran? So you should have the tools to be able to respond to these types of issues for the people around the debate that may occur. So anyways, when it comes to the Quran, we should all strive, inshallah ta'ala, to understand the meaning of what we're even reading. And I understand that word for word, sometimes you miss some of the full depth and breadth of the meanings of the words of the Quran, and that's absolutely true. But we should also at the same time be striving to get as much mufradat al-lugha, as much of the Arabic vocabulary as we can, so we can start building a closer connection with the Quran. I personally found that Quran.com now, and as well as the Green Tech Quran app, is very good at least getting a word-for-word meaning of the entire Quran. I'm not saying that's the pinnacle of what you need to do, but I'm saying you should have a base understanding of what the Quran is actually saying. And also there are some translations that would help you out a lot while you're looking at the word-for-word meaning. So Sahih International is very good for being genuine to the word-for-word meaning, but it doesn't usually give the nuances and the metaphors and the balagha and the poetic eloquence of the Quran. So Mustafa al-Khattab's The Clear Quran, that version, he's an Egyptian scholar, but he lives, I think, in Toronto or Canada, so he's fluent in both English and Arabic. He spends a lot of time talking about the nuances of the Quran. That's why I personally like that. If I was to look at the word-for-word translation of the Quran, not just the bulk translation, but the word-for-word translation, then I would look at the Sahih International translation to see what the word-for-word meaning is, but then I could see the subtleties in the language if I look at Mustafa al-Khattab's Clear Quran. Because you have to understand that the Quran has this dynamic, right? It's not, and ask any person who's Arab, right? Because personally, I'm not Arab, right? I'm not going to claim or pretend to be. But if I ask anybody who is, like for example, the Arabic teachers that work at the school that I work at Al Taqwa Academy, they'll tell me, in Arabic, you have to be very careful because there are many things you cannot just take for the word-for-word meaning. There are many nuances and subtleties. So I'm saying that's definitely something that you want to have on the agenda, but where you can start is by getting the word-for-word meaning, start looking at translations that look at nuances versus the literal meaning, and then of course, if you can start to add tafsir to that, both of these websites would help because both of them have 3 tafsir in English and in Arabic, and maybe partially in Urdu. So they have Tafsir Ibn Kathir, ayah by ayah. So instead of going through 6,000 or 8,000 pages of Tafsir Ibn Kathir, you have a specific ayah you want the tafsir of, you can go to the 3 dots for like more options, go directly to the Tafsir Ibn Kathir for any ayah of the Quran. You can do the same thing for the Tafsir of Tadhkir al-Quran. That's another tafsir that's available. And then there's also one that was written by Sheikh Taqiyuddin al-Osmani from Pakistan, if I remember correctly, Ma'rif al-Quran. It's like an 8-volume tafsir. That is also connected with now Quran.com and Green Tech Quran, which is an app that you can get for Apple and for Android. So for us to really appreciate and connect with the Quran and be able to defend it and understand its layers, then we should start taking the means. And these are tools that are available to everybody. So if you speak Arabic or English, the tafsir are in both languages. So inshallah, that should help us out a lot, inshallah ta'ala. Sunnah.com, there are other resources like Al-Maktaba, Al-Shama'ila. But the thing is that, or Al-Shama'il, but Sunnah.com is nice because it has English and Arabic for basically 16 major books of hadith. So for Imam Malik's Muwatta, for the Sunan Sitta, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, and Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi. For all those books, you have the English, the Arabic, and you have the takhrij or the hukm of the hadith. You have the grading of the hadith. For Bukhari and Muslim, they don't usually write the grading, and that's because, according to some scholars, there is no weak hadith in Sahih Bukhari. Some say there is 80 that are actually under scrutiny, and some have argued, no, that's not the case. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, very famous Shafi'i scholar and muhaddith, has basically written a book that shows that through other asanid, all those 80 ahadith that were said to be question mark because the hadith is mu'allaq, because the hadith seems to have a missing person in the chain of transmission. There's actually another hadith where there's no missing transmission. So that Imam Bukhari did not make a mistake is basically what Ibn Hajar Asqalani is trying to tell you. So Sunnah.com though, as I was trying to get to, is it's a nice resource to be able to access these 16 major books of hadith in English and in Arabic, and also in a copy-paste fashion. You're doing da'wah, street da'wah, or social media da'wah, or you're going to start talking in masajid or in libraries or somewhere in public. You can copy and paste these into a Google Doc, into Google Slides. So it's very easy to basically start building up your library of resources using Sunnah.com and making some documents. For Usul al-Fiqh, there are rules for interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. It's not just a blanket, just observing the ayat and see what do I personally feel these words mean, or what based on my knowledge of the Arabic language. In Usul al-Fiqh, you have to understand there's a difference between ayat that are am and khas, and that, for example, khas ayat, ayat that are specific in meaning, take precedence over general. Then you have something called nasikh and mansukh. You have ayat and ahadith that are, you have an abrogator, and then you have an abrogated evidence. So some things, through the timeline of the 23 years of wahi, some ayat and ahadith replace the hukm of another ayah and hadith. So you need to know when nasikh and when mansukh happens in the Quran and when it happens in hadith. There are other rules. For example, the illah. If you know the illah, the reason behind an ayah or a hadith, the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh will tell you that if the illah is present, then the hukm is applied. And if the illah is not present, then the hukm is not applicable anymore. So it can completely affect if you can use a ruling or not. You need to know these things, because if you're debating people on these issues, then if you know this type of stuff, you're not going to get trapped. And also, you're going to know your limitations as a Muslim as well, because this stuff really affects the overall verdicts of what people can do and how they can do it. So Usul al-Fiqh, I'm not saying you have to become a scholar in this. I'm just saying take an introductory course to Usul al-Fiqh. Like, for example, take Sheikh Adnan's course on Matan al-Waraqat. He's offered it twice. This is one of the most, from my understanding, even the other madhahib, they use it. Matan al-Waraqat, even though it was written by Imam Jawaini, who was the teacher of Imam al-Ghazali, most people respect this book of Usul as being one of the earliest and well laid out books for understanding the basics. Technically, the Ar-Risala was written by Imam al-Shafi'i a little bit earlier than that, but this is a book that has multiple shuruh on it. That's why it becomes a good resource. Aside from that, I already talked about Usul Hadith for like probably 10 minutes straight, but like taking a book like Nuqbatul Fiqh by Ibn Hajar Asqalani, taking an introductory course to Hadith so you can understand which Hadith are mutawatir and sahih and hasan and da'if and mawdu', and you can understand what can be used as evidence and what cannot. That way, you don't get trapped in a debate discussing something that you shouldn't be discussing. Or you can help the non-Muslim, or in some cases even the Muslim, direct them to what is authentic and what should be looked at. And then when it comes to base versus comparative fiqh, nobody here has to become a scholar of all the madhahib. And it's definitely, I would say it's mustahab. As long as some scholars obviously know it in detail, then it's good enough. But why this would help you is I gave you examples in the past when it comes to the issue of how we pray. Like we said before, if a Hanafi prays with his hands below the navel, we have a hadith for this, and we have a hadith above the navel. And both of them have been scrutinized. Both of them said there may be some weakness in it. That means that it's an equal playing field here. And we have two madhahib, the Malikis and the Shafi'is with one position, and the Hanafis and the Hanbalis, one with the other position. So when we know about these differences, we will not fight over these subtle, minute issues, which we said there's a qa'idah in Islam, la inkar fi misa'il al-khilaf. There's no condemnation on valid differences of opinion. So when we know this, we don't fight over the issues we shouldn't be fighting about. And also, if non-Muslims bring up these issues, then we remind them that this is from the mercy of Allah, that some issues in Islam are dhanni, are speculative, and this allows for some flexibility in the deen, and also helps us to strive to want to build a greater connection with the faith, because not everything was laid out bone dry for us. I'm just going to speed up a little bit because I know I only have 2 minutes left. We did a lot of questions today, so I don't think we're going to be able to cover everything. And then this thing doesn't want to work for me right now. I was hoping to get one more slide in. What's going on with this? It's not working, the projector. Can you push the... No, go the other direction. Just go the other direction one more time. Other direction. The other way. No, the opposite direction. Forward, forward, forward until we get to there. Just stop there. We're going to have to split this lecture into two because of the time. But basically, I'm going to go really fast in this, and I might even re-elaborate, inshallah, in the next session. But when it comes to the issue of usul al-aqidah, there are some issues in aqidah. Well, this might burst your bubble, but there are some things that are actually not solvable. Not solvable in this dunya. There are some issues with the sifat and the asma of Allah Azza wa Jal. We will not know until the day of judgment. That's why you have some scholars of aqidah that they will do tafweed. They will just say, we believe in what Allah said, and we're not going to do ta'wil. And there are scholars that will do ta'wil. They will try to interpret some of these ayat that could have different possible meanings. And there are others that just try to take the sort of the more literal approach, but without doing how should I say this? Billa kayf, without trying to say how or try to do what's called tashbih, try to compare it to Allah's creation, but they affirm the original meanings of Arabic of what Allah said about Himself. So these opinions exist, and these are things that we have to tolerate, inshallah ta'ala, because Allah did not make the issue clear-cut for us. I don't think we're going to have enough time to cover all the Islamic sciences, inshallah. So inshallah, next class, we'll go more into detail about this. But the purpose obviously was that as du'at, we need to be well-rounded in the Islamic sciences so we know what's worth debating and what's not worth debating, inshallah ta'ala. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته